I've always believed that every marriage, no matter how perfect it looks, carries its own set of cracks. Ours, though, seemed different, stronger somehow. Emily and I had been married for 7 years, and while we weren't without our share of arguments, we'd always come back to each other like gravity pulling us home. She was my world, her laugh the melody that played in the background of my life. If you'd asked me a few months ago, I'd have said our relationship was unshakable. Now, I'm not so sure. Emily and I met at an art gallery opening. She was standing in front of a vibrant abstract piece, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, completely lost in thought. I was there with a friend, barely interested in the art, but something about the way she tilted her head made me want to introduce myself. That night, we bonded over cheap wine and an expensive exhibit, and the rest, as they say, is history. We built a life around shared interests, art exhibits on weekends, movie marathons on lazy Sundays, and hikes in the nearby hills when the weather was kind. She had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary, of filling the spaces in my life I hadn't even realized were empty. I thought we were happy. At least, I was. But over the last few months, something shifted. It started small. Emily began spending longer hours at her art sessions, something she'd picked up as a hobby during the pandemic. She'd always loved painting, and I supported her interest wholeheartedly, even turning our spare bedroom into a makeshift studio. At first, it was charming, watching her lose herself in creativity, her face smeared with streaks of paint. But then, it became an obsession. She started staying out later, claiming she needed inspiration or time to work with Lucas. Lucas was a local artist she'd met 2 years ago at a workshop. He was a rising star in the art world, the kind of man who could command attention just by walking into a room. I'd met him a few times at exhibits Emily insisted we attend, and while he seemed charming enough, there was always something about him that rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way his gaze lingered on Emily a second too long, or how he'd call her his muse, with a smirk that felt more personal than professional. Still, I trusted her. I had no reason not to. Then, the little things started piling up. Emily became secretive with her phone, a habit she'd never had before. She'd turn it away when a text came in or excuse herself to answer calls. She'd cancel our plans at the last minute, always with a vague excuse about an art emergency. And when she was home, her mind seemed elsewhere, her laughter quieter, her smile forced. It was as though I was living with a stranger who wore Emily's face. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. Marriage ebbs and flows, I thought. Maybe she was just stressed, caught up in her work. But the harder I tried to ignore it, the louder my doubts became. One night, as we lay in bed, I asked her about it. "Emily, are we okay?" I said, my voice tentative. She looked at me, her eyes briefly widening before she gave me a tired smile. "Of course, Michael. Why wouldn't we be?" "I don't know," I said, hating how uncertain I sounded. "You've just seemed distracted lately." "It's just the art," she said, turning on her side and facing away from me. "I've been pushing myself. It's nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But something about the way she said it, so rehearsed, so flat, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't until last week that the cracks in our perfect image began to widen. She'd been out for hours at another session with Lucas, leaving me home to my usual routine of coding and streaming mindless TV. When she came back, she was flushed, her hair slightly mussed, and there was a faint trace of cologne I didn't recognize. I didn't say anything, but my mind raced. "Long session?" I asked casually, watching her as she kicked off her shoes and avoided my gaze. "Yeah," she said, brushing past me toward the kitchen. "We were working on something big." I followed her, leaning against the counter as she poured herself a glass of water. "What kind of big?" She hesitated, and for the first time, I noticed a flicker of something in her expression, guilt, maybe. A new series, she said quickly. Lucas thinks it's going to be my best work yet. I wanted to push further, to ask why she hadn't mentioned this big series before or why she seemed so defensive. But instead, I nodded and let it slide. It wasn't the first time I'd ignored my instincts for the sake of peace. Now, though, I can't ignore it anymore. There's a growing distance between us, a chasm filled with secrets I can't quite put my finger on. Emily is hiding something, I know it in my gut. And if I'm being honest, I'm terrified to find out what it is. The thing about suspicion is that it plants a seed in your mind, and once it's there, it grows, unrelenting, choking out any semblance of rationality. That seed had been sprouting ever since Emily's late-night returns and evasive answers became routine. But what I found on her laptop turned it into a towering, unshakable tree. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the mundane filled the silence. Emily had gone out again, something about needing to finalize details for a new exhibit. I was home alone, picking at the remnants of a lukewarm dinner and absently scrolling through work emails. As I cleaned up, I noticed her laptop on the dining table, the screen still lit. I hesitated. Emily had always been protective of her things, not secretive, just cautious. But tonight, with that creeping unease gnawing at me, I felt a pull stronger than my conscience. I told myself it wasn't snooping. I wasn't prying into her private life, I was looking for reassurance. At least, that's what I kept repeating in my head as I opened her laptop. The screen blinked awake, and there it was, a tab still open to her email. Most of it was mundane, newsletters, a receipt from an art supply store, and a confirmation email. But it was the sender's name that caught my attention, Lucas M. I felt a pang in my chest as I clicked the email. The message was brief. Looking forward to our session tomorrow. Your progress on the series has been incredible, it's a privilege to work with you. Usual time, usual place. Lucas. The words felt innocuous, but the undertone gnawed at me. Usual time. Usual place. This wasn't a casual collaboration, it was a routine, one that clearly excluded me. I sat back, the air around me thick with a tension I couldn't shake. My mind went back to the first time I met Lucas. He'd been charismatic, with that effortless charm some people have, the kind that feels practiced but still disarming. At the time, I chalked up his lingering gaze on Emily to artistic appreciation. He'd called her his muse, a term I'd laughed off, thinking it was harmless. Now, the memory made my stomach turn. Still, an email wasn't proof of anything. I could have closed the laptop then, pretended I hadn't seen it, but the tree of suspicion had roots now. Before I knew it, I was searching. Her browser history didn't reveal much, mostly art blogs, supply orders, and one other link that made my breath hitch, Lucas's portfolio website. I clicked it. The homepage greeted me with bold colors and a gallery of his work. Most of it was impressive, abstract pieces with bursts of vibrant energy. But what I found hidden under a tab labeled Private Collection shattered whatever calm I had left. The password protection on the tab gave me pause, but Emily had shared enough of her life with me that I could guess. Her name was the key, and the page opened to a series of portraits that made my heart sink. They were of Emily. Not the kind of portraits you'd expect from a professional artist. These weren't casual, posed, or detached. These were intimate, achingly personal. There she was, draped in soft fabrics, her bare shoulders catching the light just so, her expression one of vulnerability and allure. One painting depicted her reclining on a chaise, the curve of her body accentuated by shadows. Another showed her gazing out a window, her hair undone, her lips slightly parted. There were over 10 of them, each more revealing than the last. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the gallery. The strokes of his brush seemed to worship her, capturing her in ways that felt too tender, too knowing. This wasn't art. This was infatuation laid bare on canvas. And Emily, my Emily, had willingly been a part of it. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Memories flooded back, moments that now felt tainted. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the scent of cologne that wasn't mine. It all pointed to this collection of portraits that spoke of a connection far deeper than she'd ever shared with me. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark as my reflection stared back at me. I didn't recognize the man looking at me, his face pale, his eyes hollow. My mind raced, trying to piece together the timeline, trying to figure out when she'd slipped away from me and into this man's orbit. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, a perfectly innocent reason for these paintings to exist. Maybe she'd been flattered by the attention. Maybe Lucas had pushed her into it, convincing her it was all for art. But deep down, I knew. You don't pose like that for someone you see as just a mentor. You don't become the centerpiece of their private collection unless something else is at play. The sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my thoughts. Emily was home. I hurried to put her laptop back, my hands fumbling as I placed it exactly where I'd found it. My heart pounded in my chest as her footsteps approached. "Hey," she said, her voice light as she walked into the dining room. "You're still up." I forced a smile, hoping the tremor in my hands wasn't visible. "Yeah, just catching up on some work." She nodded, her eyes flicking briefly to her laptop. I watched her closely, trying to read her expression. She seemed calm, at ease, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. "I'm going to shower," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I flinched, and she pulled back, her brow furrowing. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just tired." She lingered for a moment, her eyes searching mine before she turned and walked upstairs. As the sound of water running filled the silence, I sat alone in the dining room, my mind a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and betrayal. The portraits were seared into my memory, each one a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed to know if there was still anything left of the Emily I thought I knew, the woman I'd loved for 7 years, or if she had already been painted over by Lucas's brush. The decision to follow Emily wasn't one I made lightly. For days, I'd wrestled with the idea, telling myself that I had enough evidence. But the image of those portraits haunted me, and the unanswered questions gnawed at my sanity. I needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. So when Emily announced she had another art session with Lucas, I forced a smile and kissed her goodbye, watching as she walked out the door. As soon as she was out of sight, I grabbed my keys and followed. The drive to Lucas's studio felt surreal, my knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. I stayed several cars behind, my heart pounding with every turn. Emily was oblivious, her car weaving through the streets with the ease of someone who felt safe, unobserved. I envied her calm. My stomach churned with every mile. When she pulled into a narrow driveway flanked by overgrown hedges, I parked down the street and got out, the cool evening air doing little to calm my nerves. Lucas's studio was a converted warehouse, its large windows glowing with warm light. I crept closer, staying in the shadows, my breath shallow as I approached the building. Peering through one of the side windows, I felt my heart drop. There they were, Lucas and Emily, framed by the soft golden light of the studio. She was perched on a stool, her laughter ringing out as Lucas adjusted her posture, his hands brushing her shoulder, then her arm. The intimacy of the moment was undeniable. They weren't just artist and muse, they were something far more. Lucas said something, and Emily threw her head back, laughing in that way she used to laugh with me. My chest tightened, anger and heartbreak warring within me. I couldn't just stand there and watch. My hands shook as I gripped the window frame, forcing myself to take a deep breath. No more waiting. No more second-guessing. I needed answers. I marched to the front door and pushed it open, the bell above it jingling loudly. Both of them turned, their expressions freezing in perfect synchrony. Emily's face paled, her mouth slightly open in shock. Lucas, on the other hand, didn't look surprised. If anything, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Michael," Emily stammered, standing up so quickly that the stool wobbled behind her. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice sharp, the anger barely contained. My eyes flicked to Lucas, who crossed his arms and leaned casually against a table, as if this was all some elaborate joke. "This isn't what it looks like," Emily said quickly, stepping toward me, her hands raised as though trying to calm me. "I told you, I'm working on a series with Lucas. That's all this is." "Art." "Art," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "Is that what you call it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a hell of a lot more than that." Emily flinched, but Lucas stepped in before she could respond. "Michael, I think you're misunderstanding the situation," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Emily is incredibly talented. She has a gift, and I'm helping her explore that. Something you clearly don't appreciate." I turned to him, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "Don't you dare talk to me about what I do or don't appreciate," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You think I don't know what this is? I've seen the portraits. I've seen the way you look at her." Lucas's smirk deepened. "And what way is that?" "Like she's yours," I snapped. "Like she's more than just a muse." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Emily looked between us, her expression a mix of panic and guilt. Finally, she stepped forward, placing herself between me and Lucas. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just calm down. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" I asked, my voice rising. "Then explain it to me, Emily. Explain the late nights. The secrecy. The way you've completely shut me out." She hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "It's not what you think. Lucas and I, this is about the work. That's all it's ever been about." I laughed bitterly. "You expect me to believe that? After everything I've seen? After everything you've lied about?" "She's not lying," Lucas interjected, his tone infuriatingly calm. "You don't understand her creative needs, Michael. That's the problem. You're too busy being, what? A jealous husband? You're stifling her." I took a step toward him, my blood boiling. "You don't get to talk about my marriage like you know anything about it," I said through gritted teeth. "This isn't about creativity. This is about boundaries. And you've crossed every single one." "Michael, stop," Emily said, placing a hand on my chest. "Please. I can't do this right now." I stepped back, her touch burning like a brand. "Then when, Emily? When are you going to start being honest with me?" She looked down, her tears falling freely now. I need time," she said quietly. "To figure things out." "Figure things out," I repeated, the words hollow in my mouth. "You mean figure out whether you want him or me?" She didn't respond. Her silence said everything. I felt the room closing in on me, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on my chest. Without another word, I turned and walked out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I got into my car and drove away, the studio lights fading in my rearview mirror, one thought consumed me: the woman I loved was gone. Whatever we'd had, whatever we'd built together, it was over. And no amount of time or explanations would change that. I sat in the darkened living room, the weight of everything pressing on my chest like a stone. The walls of our home felt narrower than ever, their familiar edges now suffocating. This was supposed to be the sanctuary we built together, a testament to the life we shared. Instead, it felt like a mausoleum for the love we once had, love that had now been dissected and displayed for someone else's admiration. Emily and I had a story worth remembering. That's what I kept telling myself, as though the repetition could dull the sting of its ending. I remembered the first time I saw her, standing under a canopy of string lights at that art gallery. She was radiant, her laughter the kind of sound that made the world seem lighter. I fell hard and fast, swept up in the orbit of her energy and passion. She was always the dreamer between us. Where I was pragmatic, grounded in numbers and logic, Emily saw the world in shades of possibility. And I loved that about her. She wanted to paint, to create, to leave her mark on the world, and I wanted to be the one who gave her the stability to do it. So I worked longer hours, accepted jobs that didn't excite me, just to make sure she had the time and resources to chase her dreams. Every sacrifice I made felt worth it, until now. Now, every memory felt like a mockery. Every late-night coding session while she painted upstairs, every time I'd picked up extra work to pay for her supplies, every moment I'd celebrated her successes as though they were my own, it all felt hollow. She hadn't just betrayed me, she'd betrayed the man who had supported her through it all. And yet, despite it all, I couldn't stop loving her. That was the cruelest part. Even knowing what I knew, some part of me still clung to the hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that the Emily I knew and loved wasn't gone. That hope shattered when I logged into our joint savings account. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a distraction, some semblance of control in the chaos. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, something caught my eye, a series of payments, all marked as transfers to Lucas's business account. Hundreds of dollars at first, then thousands. The studio rentals. The private sessions. The materials. She'd paid for all of it. With our money. I stared at the screen, my mind a storm of disbelief and fury. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity. Emily hadn't just cheated on me emotionally, she had used the life we built together to fund it. She'd taken the money we'd saved for a future, our future, and handed it over to the man who'd driven a wedge between us. The hurt I'd been trying to suppress exploded into anger. I slammed the laptop shut and stood, pacing the room as my thoughts spiraled. How could she? How could she look me in the eye, kiss me goodbye, and then turn around and use our hard-earned money to fuel her affair? The anger didn't fade. If anything, it hardened into something colder, more resolute. I wasn't going to sit back and let her take everything. If she thought she could manipulate me, lie to me, and still come out unscathed, she was wrong. I was done being the quiet, supportive husband. It was time to reclaim control. The plan began to take shape in the early hours of the morning. I sat at the kitchen table, the glow of my laptop illuminating the notepad beside me. Every detail of Emily's betrayal, the emails, the portraits, the payments, was laid out before me like evidence in a trial. But this wasn't just about confronting her anymore. That confrontation had left me hollow, her vague promises of figuring things out ringing empty in my ears. No, this was about something more. Justice, maybe. Or revenge. Symbolic revenge, to be exact. Something that would hit where it hurt most, her precious art. I opened Lucas's portfolio website, the gallery of Emily's portraits staring back at me like ghosts. I stared at them, my anger sharpening into focus. Lucas had painted her as he wanted to see her, vulnerable, seductive, his muse. And Emily had let him, offering parts of herself that she'd once reserved for me. It was only fitting, I thought, to turn that vision on its head. I reached out to a digital artist I'd worked with in the past, a talented designer who specialized in caricatures and visual storytelling. I pitched the idea, framing it as an art project of my own. The brief was simple: take Lucas's portraits of Emily and transform them into exaggerated, grotesque versions. Her alluring poses would become awkward and contorted, her serene expressions would morph into caricatures of vanity and deceit. The artist didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Within days, I had a folder of completed images, each one a distorted mirror of Lucas's original work. It was perfect, ugly, clever, and undeniably symbolic. The next step was ensuring an audience. Lucas had a gallery show coming up, one Emily had been gushing about for weeks. She'd planned to attend, of course, basking in the glow of their so-called artistic collaboration. What she didn't know was that I had already contacted the gallery owner, posing as an interested collector with connections to potential buyers. A few well-placed suggestions, paired with a generous offer to sponsor the event, were enough to secure what I needed. On the night of the show, the gallery was buzzing with energy. Artists, critics, and collectors mingled under the warm glow of the overhead lights. I arrived early, blending into the crowd as I watched Emily and Lucas from a distance. She was radiant, her laughter infectious as she floated from one guest to another. Lucas was by her side, the two of them a picture of creative synergy. They had no idea what was coming. The gallery was packed, the air buzzing with that blend of anticipation and pretension that only the art world could muster. Glasses of champagne clinked as attendees mingled, their voices a low hum of chatter. Emily was in her element, surrounded by admirers, her face lit with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in months. Lucas was never far from her side, basking in the glow of their shared spotlight. I stood near the back of the room, watching it all unfold. The guests were a mix of friends, family, and colleagues. Emily had invited them herself, eager to showcase her collaboration with Lucas. I recognized a few faces, her boss from the marketing firm where she worked part-time, her best friend Claire, even her parents. They all smiled warmly at her, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The gallery owner took the stage, tapping a microphone to gather everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate the incredible talent of Lucas Martin," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Tonight, we're thrilled to unveil a special collection, a deeply personal series that Lucas has worked on with his muse, Emily." There were murmurs of admiration, scattered applause. I caught Emily's proud smile as she glanced at Lucas, his arm brushing hers in a way that felt deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," the gallery owner continued, gesturing to a curtain-draped section of the room, "I give you the muse." The curtain dropped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the laughter began. It started as a few scattered chuckles, unsure and tentative. But as the crowd processed what they were seeing, the laughter grew, swelling into a chorus of amusement and disbelief. The caricatures, with their grotesque exaggerations and biting humor, stared back at the onlookers, mocking the very essence of Lucas's original work. Emily's serene expressions had been replaced with exaggerated smirks and wide-eyed vanity. Her elegant poses had become awkward contortions, her vulnerability twisted into a parody of self-absorption. Each piece was a satirical masterpiece, a scathing commentary on the dynamic between artist and muse. The color drained from Emily's face as she stared at the collection, her smile frozen in place. Beside her, Lucas's expression darkened, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the crowd's reaction. What is this?" Emily stammered, her voice barely audible over the laughter. I stepped forward, weaving through the crowd until I was standing in front of her. All eyes turned to me as I reached into my jacket and pulled out a crisp envelope. "Emily," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the noise. "You've always wanted to be the star of the show. Well, now you have your audience." I handed her the envelope, her trembling hands closing around it. She looked down, her confusion shifting to shock as she read the words printed on the front, "Petition for divorce." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Michael," she whispered, as though saying my name could somehow undo everything. I didn't give her the chance to speak. "You made your choices, Emily," I said, my voice steady. "You chose to lie, to betray, to take everything we built together and throw it away. You thought you could walk all over me, use me to fund your little fantasies, and I'd just stand by and let it happen." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Around us, the crowd had gone silent, the weight of the moment settling over them. But I'm done being the supportive husband who sacrifices everything for someone who takes it for granted, I continued. You wanted your big moment. Here it is. Enjoy it. I turned to Lucas, whose smug demeanor had been replaced with a look of utter humiliation. And you, I said, my voice sharp. Maybe next time, pick a muse who doesn't have a husband willing to fight back. With that, I walked away, the envelope still clutched in Emily's shaking hands. Outside the gallery, the air was cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. I stood on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath as the adrenaline coursing through me began to fade. It was over. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity, a weight lifted from my shoulders. Emily and I were done. The life we'd built together was gone, but so was the toxic web of lies and betrayal that had ensnared me. I thought back to the man I'd been before all of this, trusting, devoted, willing to put someone else's dreams before my own. It wasn't a bad way to be, not entirely. But it had blinded me to the truth, left me vulnerable to someone who had taken advantage of my loyalty. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to put my thoughts into words, to make sense of everything I'd been through. I began to type. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: trust your instincts. When something feels off, it probably is. Love makes us blind, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the signs. Never sacrifice your self-respect for someone who doesn't value it. And when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. I paused, rereading the words before saving them. Maybe I'd share them one day, maybe not. Either way, they were mine, a reminder of the lesson I'd learned the hard way. As I walked away from the gallery, the laughter from inside still faintly audible, I felt a sense of resolve. The man who had walked into that building was not the same one who was leaving it. This Michael, the one stepping into the cool night air, was stronger, wiser, and ready to reclaim his life. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.